but it includes, let's say, class factor, race factor, ethnicity as factors, and physical spaces like geographical location, whether it's a city or a village that people live in, geographical location as factors. So thinking about a triangulated picture in the third session of Corona Conversations, Mobility in a Post-COVID Future, we are interested to explore the gender angle of the pandemic. That is how gendered the experience of this pandemic has been for males and non-males, and how other factors of social locations like class, ethnicity, etc. play around with gender as the pivot. Now, so with a very big thank you to all of you for joining us today, and despite all the technical issues which has become a part of our everyday lives too, let us please welcome Professor Ayona Datta from University College London to engage in a conversation with me today on gendering the pandemic, survival as resistance in times of crisis. So thank you so much, Professor Datta, for taking time out to talk to us today. I hope I'm audible to you.
Yes, you are. And I'm really sorry for the technical difficulties.
No problem. So let's just continue. No worries, but thank you so much for being with us today in here. And we are really excited to have you here, especially because, as I was telling you, before we began formally, that, the topic of conversation is such that we could not really think about a more befitting person in recent times than you. Your latest project, I was just, reading on them, and your latest project on gendering the smart, safe city, and the way you are engaging with mobility through the concept of Ana Jana, which is also hashtag, and then digital mobility and the physical mobility, and the way you are connecting them together. And also you're addressing of the question of safety from the perspectives of temporality and subjectivity. So I think all of these could be extremely relevant for discussing the question of gendering the pandemic per se today that we're going to have. So we are really thankful, and I hope that you enjoy the conversation with me in the beginning and with the listeners after that as much as we are definitely going to enjoy conversing with you. So before we formally begin, just a couple of things regarding the session today. This session is going to be a split between a conversation between Professor Datta and I, and then followed by an open house where the conversation will continue and the listeners could ask questions and share their comments. And regarding the timeline, so our conversation between Professor Datta and I will be for around 30-35 minutes, and the next open house could be for around 20 minutes, and we can take 5 to 10 minutes extra if we need so. The conversation between the first half of the conversation, that is between me and Professor Datta, that part is going to be recorded, and the open house will not be recorded, and the recorded portion of our session will be available at the GSSC website, and it will be open access. So please do not take pictures or record any portion of the entire discussion, and you can access it later, if you would like to. Now, regarding interacting with Professor Datta in the open house, please hold your questions till we are done with the first half of the session, and then please raise your press the raise your hand button on Zoom. And then, you could introduce yourself and ask the question in the open house. But in case of a technical glitch where you are unable to ask the question directly, you may please write the question in the chat box and we will be taking them up. So this is largely the structural specifics regarding the session. And now let us formally start with the conversation. So, Professor Datta, this pandemic has reinvented the phrase work from home at several levels. And this definitely involves certain processes, stages, and lived experiences where both work and home, as terms we use in common knowledge, are kind of undergoing evolution and rethinking in terms of what they come to mean, in the present context. What do they mean in the context of this pandemic? So, as a sociologist, to me, this entire idea of work from home, it unfolds, it appears as a crossroads of gender, class, race, ethnicity, location. And because, work from home as an idea, it is not experienced uniformly across cultures and societies. In fact, the very terms like work and home constitute distinct meaning for different genders across class and ethnic backgrounds and across different parts of the world. So I am just inquisitive to ask you here, how would you reflect on this new discourse of work from home during COVID-19 pandemic from the perspective of home as a physical space?
Mhm. Thank you. That's a very important question, actually, and probably is the perfect question to start with. And I'd actually say that support what your question about home and work meaning very different things for different people. Because as a feminist, as a feminist urban geographer, the first thing we learn is home is the workplace for most women. And so, in that sense, work from home had never been something unusual for many women for whom work was actual social reproduction, working domestic work at home. It's just that I think in policy, it was never ever completely accepted that women actually work at home. And always with the kind of gender empowerment policies you've seen, starting with the UN policies and Millennium Goals, and even now with Sustainable Development Goals, you see the majority of policies is about extracting women outside, taking them out of the home and pushing them into economically productive labor outside the home. So in that sense, I think the new normal for it's been more of an adjustment for policymakers to think of work from home, because for women, work from home was a everyday regular reality for forever. But having said that, the meaning now that work from home has taken is that home is not just the site of domestic labor, it's also now the site of economically productive labor. And that's kind of become gendered and classed, because that economically productive labor is largely more or less amongst the middle classes, because who else but the middle classes and the professionals can make it possible for themselves to work at home? I mean, we can get all these gadgets and we can do desk work because largely our economic work was also desk work. Now, when you think about manual labor, that's almost impossible to work from home, whether you're a man or a woman, or if you're in informally occupied labor, if you are a domestic help in some other middle class colony, that sort of work from home is impossible. So work from home has got very different subjective, affective, emotional associations now for different sections of society, depending upon your intersectional positionalities, whether you're working classes, whether you're middle class, whether you're a woman or a man, whether you're transgender. It's taken on a new significance under the pandemic. But in terms of actually thinking about it conceptually, work from home has always been a reality for women, and indeed that recognition that women actually do work at home has been a long time coming. And I'm not sure that even now that recognition has happened, because now work from home is still considered as working for the economic productivity from home rather than working for domestic social reproduction at home. So that I guess that's what's interesting and unusual now at this moment.
Right. So interesting you point out that, home has been the workplace for women for forever and historically speaking. And of course, I mean, the intersectionality of, those who can afford immobility and those who cannot afford immobility. So those who cannot afford, they have to go out and work, but nevertheless, outside home. But nevertheless, home remains that physical space with a lot of implications. And one of the implications, especially during the COVID period, has been restrictions, because COVID-induced restrictions that we are calling. So isolation and quarantine at home are the kind of the social protocols, the health protocols that we are also having to follow at some level time to time. Now, so it's common knowledge now that, COVID has restricted mobility. But how do you think that this restriction impacts people across the gender spectrum? For example, I'll just give an example. In general, and specifically as a woman growing up in South Asia, restricted mobility in public spaces is not something I have been unfamiliar with. In fact, also sometimes in private spaces, like, if you have lived in a shared apartment or a multi-storied building, then the terrace of the building, late in the evening or wee hours in the morning is kind of, prohibited for you to move around. Now, whether one likes it or not, but one is thrown into this kind of a social protocol, and if one resists that practice, then one has already defied the normal. Now, but now with the pandemic, the new normal, so to say, imposes restrictions on mobility, apparently not based on gender, but other factors like health, profession, age, so other social locations, as you just pointed out. So from that perspective, do you think that the protocol of restricted mobility kind of mimics the unequal gender practices that have already been normalized in several conservative societies, including the South Asian countries?
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is yes. It resonates, it mimics, but it's also pronounced and reinforced. And perhaps this is how your first and second question are connected. I mean, immobility is also connected to concentrated mobilities in particular places. So when you think about immobility in the context of a pandemic, it also means that inside the home, inside their neighborhoods, women had actually more mobility because the men would leave for work. And when women were at home and without those eyes of surveillance of the men or the particular family members who would have gone out, they would have had a bit more mobility within their home, within their neighborhood, to do things at that time during the day when there were, their mother, when their fathers or their brothers or their husbands weren't around. What has happened because of the pandemic is that increased immobility on men has actually resulted in increased immobility on women within these kind of across these physical spaces of the home and the neighborhood and so on. So in that sense, it has definitely reinforced. But it also has a gendered repercussion, because as in our work with the Gendering the Smart City, because we've been looking at particularly young women in these peripheral low-income neighborhoods, it has a different kind of sense of immobility, that is the immobility that comes from economic impoverishment. And by that, I mean, when their men are, they lose their jobs, because the biggest sector that's been affected because of these restrictions is the informal sector. Right. And most of the working classes in India particularly are in the informal sector. And then of course, many women are also part of this informal sector. So it's affected both men and women in different ways. But that has meant that there's been less money to go around the home. So if there's less money, what do you cut down on? You cut down on what is perceived as the luxuries, the phone recharge, the ability to pay for sanitary napkins, for example. And so simple things that were even possible, even in low-income neighborhoods, have been cut down on. And so in that sense, then the repercussions begin to be seen in a very gendered way. So these young women, even though they had enormous amount of surveillance and restrictions on their bodies, on their spaces, they were, like you say, Amrita, they were, immobile to a certain extent. They've seen that immobility also in terms of their cruising in digital space, because in a context where physical mobility was very difficult, particularly at certain times of the day, the mobile phone was a way for them to vicariously travel, see other places, communicate with other people. And not being able to recharge the mobile phone has effectively put them in a very severe lockdown across in kind of an internet lockdown that has impacted on their mental health, impacted on their well-being, and actually reinforced that physical lockdown in their places. And then associated with that is the idea of urban infrastructure. So infrastructure was always a problem. There's less access to water, toilets, public transport, and so on. Right. But because of the lockdown, the inability to go to public toilets at the time and whenever the frequency that they could before has been curbed. So there's a limit on how many people can get there at one time. There's a limit on how many people can get in a bus at the same time. And all of that has just kind of been pronounced because of that. So the inability to access public toilets, and imagine that what impact that has on menstrual health, that has had like heightened impact on young women on top of everything else. And then, of course, that leads to the question of the intimate surveillance within the home. So even when they were within the home before and their bodies and spaces were under heightened surveillance, now the fact that they can't use the mobile phone to escape that surveillance, the fact that every step of their lives in the home is now controlled by the men who are also inside the home, the fact that there are more members inside the home during the day, which increases their domestic labor of cooking, of cleaning.
Yes.
Somehow men don't seem to understand that actually it has increased their labor. They increase the labor of the women because the men are sitting at home and not actually doing anything. There are more people to feed and there's less money to go around. So there are a lot of nuances and intricacies of this working from home, this immobility in public spaces, that has actually also led to increased immobility across digital and material spaces. And that's particularly in the research that we're doing, it's a young women who are particularly affected by these. I mean, they can't even make phone calls anymore to their friends because their fathers are watching them inside the home during the daytime, which they could do before.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as you said in the beginning, that immobility on men has resulted in immobility on women, and that actually has a lot of repercussion. And that's where we are now. I'm just trying to get into, like, we have been reading so many news reports on domestic violence and child abuse, which have increased manifold times during the pandemic, and women and other non-male actors are perhaps more vulnerable to domestic abuse than coronavirus. I mean, at least if not more, but equally, and that is quite a statistic. So on one occasion, like in Pune in India, we read that we heard that the abusers were sent away to correctional facilities instead of the survivor being sent away to protection centers. So this is quite something new, because usually we would always like to move we have, I mean, always seen that the survivors are being moved from the location of violence, but several times the location of violence is also the home of the survivor. So dislocating the survivor from the location of violence also means something, has repercussions. So instead of that, this time we saw that the perpetrators are being moved away. And so there are all sorts of mechanisms going on to address this entire, whatever is going on at home because of different immobilities of different actors. And sometimes through the intervention of the state. For example, in Paris, where hotels were turned into, sanatoriums for survivors, they could come in and they could find a safe space. And sometimes through also NGOs flashing helpline numbers in social media, like short films trying to sensitize women, giving indirect, nuances as to, okay, you cough or you just tell a name, and just to alert the police to the, occasion of you being harassed and you being violated at home. So among all these considerations, what do you think would be a solid plan of action to structurally address this crisis within crisis, that is domestic abuse during a pandemic?
Yeah, definitely. This has been one of the key issues, and again with the people that we are doing research in Delhi and the organizations that we're working with. I mean, this is something that they're highlighting continuously. There is no simple solution, and as you say, it's been called the shadow pandemic, the domestic violence issue. I think this is where we really see how the whole technological solutionism falls apart. You were referring earlier to my work on the smart safe city, and this is where we see the whole argument that policy making is about safety, is that safety is stranger danger. Gender-based violence is something that happens to you outside the home in public places, and therefore the solution is to put more CCTV cameras, more safety apps, and somehow monitor and surveil women through their smartphones, and technology can solve it. So with the shadow pandemic, you see actually most of these cases, which feminists and feminist organizations always said, that gender-based violence is actually done on women by people who are the most known to them. So it's either a neighbor or a family member or a relative. And living in these close quarters has created the situation where reporting on the pandemic, reporting on this gender-based violence issue, domestic abuse issue, is becoming harder and harder for them, because obviously the perpetrator is within close hearing distance. So some of the work I know that has been done with the organizations we work with is particularly giving women different numbers to call, and having kind of code words through which to report these, and then the social workers would come to their homes pretending to be someone else to provide food rations, etc., and providing that sort of a support. So actually, and this is where the notion of survival as resistance comes in. The fact that they're surviving through this pandemic under very difficult conditions of pandemic is not a form of resilience. It's actually resisting that's been done to them. And many of these women are taking the option to resist this sort of coercive force that is both structural but also societal and cultural. And in many cases, actually, it's very, very hard to resolve, because this is where physical place becomes so important. And, you know, despite all of these big arguments about the digital bridging all the gaps during pandemic, it actually shows to us how important physical places are in a context of domestic violence, and how difficult it is to make policy to address this issue within the home. And with the people that we've been working with the organizations, I mean, one of the key things that they've been doing is to actually train the men to do counseling sessions with the men, because a lot of this is about this loss of masculinity. A lot of this is about feeling worthless. You know, you've lost your job, and you know, you have to be dependent even more so on your wives and your daughters. So in a way, it is also the age-old argument that feminist organizations have used, that, you know, train the men, train the boys, let them, you know, create empathy, create sympathy amongst them, let them understand that it's okay not to have a job, and don't feel insecure about yourself. So once that sort of cultural change comes, it's only then possible to deal with it, because otherwise we'll just be firefighting at every crisis about domestic violence, and domestic violence just increases at every crisis. You know, economic recession, domestic violence increases, pandemic, domestic violence increases, terror threats, domestic. So every crisis creates domestic violence concerns. It's not that it ever went away. It just comes more into visibility because of this. So I think the clear argument for a policy level intervention would be increased counseling for the men and increased support for the women. But also, I think we need to think about how women have provided survival mechanisms to each other, and therefore resisted the horrible effects of this pandemic by just providing networks of solidarity and support. One of the other organizations that we work with very closely is in Kibera in Kenya. And they have been actually training the young women to use map-based apps, and they go from home to home doing surveys of who's locked out, which women are locked out without their families, without any food rations, and they map these for the organizations, the NGO organizations, to see where to provide support. The same thing's been happening in a place like Bangalore, where again we're doing some work in, and where the transgender community has been really severely affected, particularly the sex workers, because these are the people who are completely outside the visibility of any kind of state welfare schemes, the visibility of any kind of opportunities, possibilities of reaching out to them, because they want to be hidden, particularly because of the nature of the work they do. So one of the key things that's happened is collecting and curating the phone numbers of these sex workers and transgender workers who used to work on the streets before, and who's obviously, because of the lockdown, have not been able to get paid or afford their food or accommodation. So creating a curated list of phone numbers in order to then find out where they are, and being able to reach food and rations to them, has been again one of the networks of solidarity and support that's been created. And I think this is where we need to also think about the whole idea of technological solutionism as a kind of universal response to every crisis. There's a silver bullet to every crisis. We don't need high technology. We don't need smart safety packages. We can make do with frugal infrastructures. And actually, there's a lot to learn from these grassroots ways of responding to crisis. And these kind of very fragmented, frugal ways of responding to small things by creating small telegram messages, phone lists, and so on.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, frugal ways of using technology. And you also talked about solidarity and support. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's not just restricts. It's not just restricted for the women, but also for different other non-male actors too. And we will come to that little later. But for at the moment, I'm kind of curious. Like, what do you think? That do you think that this entire what about the practice of restricted mobility during the COVID period? And do you think that it will become a norm in the long run as an imposition on people for to build a mechanism of control? I'll just give an example. Like the protest movements on the streets have already faced a big backlash. I mean, since we're talking about solidarity and the support groups, so the protest movements time to time, especially that women and other non-male actors engage into, they have faced a big backlash because governments in different parts of the world are not allowing big gatherings. Now, but despite that, for example, in Poland, very recently, we witnessed thousands of women gathering to protest against anti-abortion laws. And later we learned that they were coming to Germany to get the necessary surgeries done because their own government would not let them have control of over their own bodies. So in the light of this, I am just curious that do you think that in a post-COVID period, different institutions, governmental and different structures could exploit the COVID-centric protocol of mobility restrictions, which was apparently essentially for health purposes, but now to control people, especially the non-male actors, from reclaiming their rights to protest and resist in a democratic, in a structural manner?
The short answer is we are already seeing the trends to this happening. How far that will go is obviously up for speculation. Right. But I think this has always been the intention of many states, many nation states, to control and monitor and govern through monitoring and surveilling. And you see intentions of that during every crisis. I mean, the terror threat is a very good example of that, if you want to take an analogy to the pandemic. But also, if you go back into the 19th century, the kind of the bubonic plague, where the first acts of restricted mobility was created from Mumbai in India under the British Empire, it was exactly about that. And in a way, when you read all that, you kind of think, well, this is nothing new. This is something that has always been the intention of the state, how to control and monitor and therefore by govern a passive population, because it's easier to govern a passive population. But of course, there are resistances from below and there's always pushback. And you see with the recent the protest movements in India and across other parts of the world, there's always pushback to that. You also, I think, what you are actually seeing now is an extension of that surveillance, extension of that control mechanism into the home, in a way that the track and trace operations work, the new apps that you have to download on your smartphone, and that actually track every single place you go, where you go, what you do there. In many different countries, there are now these selfie apps for quarantining, in which you have to upload your selfie from inside your home that is geotagged, so the authorities know that you are inside the home. So it is definitely an extension of the surveillance, the intimate surveillance of society, extending into the physical places of the home through your bodies as well. And it is up for grabs in terms of how far this goes. I think it's gone pretty far enough already. So it's to be seen whether the home now becomes the new normal space of surveillance, whereas usually you wouldn't think that the home is. I mean, of course, in the way we use our technology makes it always possible to collect data about us. But in terms of surveillance by the state, direct surveillance by the state, this was usually the CCTV cameras in the public spaces, but now it is inside your home, inside your bodies, and if you sneeze or you cough, and you've got to report that. And it's obviously it's important to do that because it is a pandemic. It needs to be controlled. But I think we have to ask very important questions about who owns this data, where does this data go, how is it analyzed, how is it stored, and what use is this data put to in the end. If it is used to the extent of feeding back into some progressive ideas around solidarity and democracy, then perfectly fine. But if that data goes into the repositories of corporates that create these apps and extract data from us without telling us what it's been used for, I think there is a problem there. And that data, if it enables us to make these governments or make these corporations accountable and transparent, I think that's a good thing. So it's also what it's used for, and we need to be very much aware of the nefarious activities that can emerge from just universal extraction of our data from us without any kind of accountability by those that are doing so.
Right. Well, I mean, in a surveillance-driven society, one is really not always very hopeful in terms of once the data is extracted, how it is going to be used, and especially with different big corporations like Facebook and other bodies taking our data even without our understanding. I mean, it is as you say, it's quite dangerous and it's quite scary as to how that is going to be utilized, and in on what ground they are going to come against you, at what level, whether it's across gender or any other spectrum. But just coming back to this, entire gendered experience of the pandemic, my question in here now is that, is the pandemic gendered in a relatively standardized manner all across the world, or do you witness remarkable variations across spaces and cultures? Because we talked about India, we're talking about Poland, and different countries we are talking about in terms of how gendered the pandemic is. But are there very structural, very remarkable structural and experiential variations of experiencing the pandemic from the perspective of gender, or are they relatively standardized in your opinion?
It's both. The standardization, I think, comes from the very top-down implementation of quarantine and track and trace. And you see there very similar approaches across different countries. And I think therein lies the problem, because the society works very differently in all of these different contexts. I mean, what does the family mean in India? The answer to that is very different from what the family might mean in the UK. And this is not to say that one is better than the other, but it's just very different cultural understandings of the family and the home. And especially the home, what the home means and the family means in working class families and middle class families, even within India or even within the UK or in any Western country. So across classes, it's very, very different. And if you see, again, I'm falling back on the research we've been doing with these young women in very low income working class settlements, the family really is an extended kinship network. And even though you call that the family, you might not stay in the same place. And a home means possibly a large family, an extended family with cousins and others coming to live in and out when somebody's looking for a job in the city. So here, if we say a home, it's usually a nuclear family living, 5 or 6, 4 or 5 members living with some children in a family. But in a working class family, the home could actually be a place where the extended family is living in very, very close quarters. So the question of what is a bubble, here we're talking about a bubble, a family bubble, looks very, very different when you look at working class communities in India that are just somehow making do and living in one room, and there may be 6 or 7 family members living in that one room. That has a very different meaning about track and trace and quarantine than a nuclear family living in a middle class neighborhood in Delhi, for example, a husband and wife and a young child. And so that family bubble is very different, and the ways that they cope with it and the ways that they get access to services and benefits is very, very different with it. And then that also leads to the question of, again, the notion of survival, whose survival are we talking about here? I mean, if it's middle classes, they can always survive because they have the means to pay for these kind of facilities. But it's always the working classes who provide that access to survival for the middle classes, the domestic help, the security guards,
Right.
the nannies, etc. That that the standardized approach towards dealing with citizens, that everybody is equal, is inherently flawed, because they're not equal. They all are, they all function different roles in society, and we have to address those different roles. And this is where I think global north, global south comes into stark relief. In the UK, there is a certain amount of recognition that people who have precarious work need to be furloughed. They need to be given some amount of support to survive when they don't have a work. For 3 months or 6 months. In India, basically, some of the welfare services has mainly been to do with giving increased rations. That might deal with the issue of food, but it doesn't deal with the issue of kind of long-term employment and well-being and mental health. And like we've already discussed, people living in really close quarters. So yeah, the standardized approach is there, but the standardized approach is inherently flawed, even within countries, within cities.
Right. Right. So, yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, standardized approaches, I mean, perhaps there could be certain critical minimum in terms of certain approaches, in terms of certain, policies, maybe. But when it comes to, like, addressing the local issues, then the cultural constructs, and even within one cultural construct, there are so very many factions. So that really becomes so relevant, as you rightly pointed out. So I'm just as we have been talking about the things all this time, I'm kind of thinking about right now three contexts where COVID, gender, and mobility are interjecting very intensely, and this is in the light of the conversation that we have been having so far. So, firstly, perhaps the monotony and what we call as household drudgery, and as you say that work was always like work from home was always a normal thing for women. So the household drudgery and monopoly, which we otherwise usually consider associate with stay at home women, and but getting back to now with the pandemic, now with COVID around, this entire experience of household drudgery is no longer restricted to these women, because uh, due to the pandemic and work from home, then mobility restrictions, zero outsource domestic help, continuous child care, continuous elderly care, and job loss.
Yeah.
Almost a lot of, I mean, not just women, but a lot of men are also having to kind of take up little bit of housework, and the concomitant. Of course, they're never used to do that, so there is a monotony and there is a drudgery. So this household drudgery, this monotony is kind of looming large on not just women at the moment, but and other actors in the house too, to some extent. Not always the case. I'm not trying to universalize it, but certain stories do emerge from that context. And so, but that is one side of the story. Now on the other side, and it is in a very like very very interesting manner, as I observe that at a very fanciful level, and I imagine this is strictly for the urban middle and upper middle income groups, housework has become very fashionable.
Yeah.
Because men have suddenly joined in the housework, and earlier it was only the women, as we have been talking about it. But and somewhere cooking and cleaning and all those very essential activities that kind of helps people survive in general are also considered to be very effeminate domains, and at best men could help, but that's enough. So but now that some men are having to pick up the broom and the mopper, it has suddenly become a thing and has become very fashionable. So WhatsApp memes and Facebook, Instagram status. So these are the spaces that one observes that when men are targeting to validate their progressiveness suddenly. So now at the face of it, all these appear to be quite promising, all right. But as a sociologist, I'm curious that the load share that at least temporarily, that men are taking in along with some women, and at what cost does it come for the women, and the non-male actors? At what cost? Is there a collateral? Are these coming forwards to share the workload even temporarily, unconditional? Or are these practices going to stay even after the pandemic is over? Or this is something just a one time thing, and then we are never going to see any kind of load share, or they come with a lot of conditions. So this is something I find very interesting. And the second concern is regarding resistance as survival. So for resistance as survival, I mean, already people who are in the disadvantaged locations, in terms of gender per se, and definitely, so those inequalities are only getting severe because of pandemic. As you said, if there's an economic crisis, there are different collateral damages, as one would put it as, like, so gender is always at a disadvantage in case of any kind of a social crisis. But in this context here, during this pandemic, schools and colleges are now shut. So a very important mechanism of resistance is education. Now, which kind of gives you the access to opportunity and kind of helps you with empowerment. Now, with the schools shut, and whenever they're open, they're largely through online teaching and learning. So especially for those countries where girl children anyway find it very hard to continue their elementary and higher education, it is a great concern that with restricted mobility, how far they will still be able to access the infrastructure to physically actually go back to school once this pandemic comes to an end, especially in South Asian and African countries where there are big gender gaps in terms of education, and very little infrastructure, public infrastructure, and state-induced encouragement and support system to send girl children to school. Does COVID somewhere imply end of education for a lot of these non-male children? And I mean, we already know that a significant number of girl children in conservative societies are prohibited from attending schools right after they attain puberty, right after their menstrual cycles begin. So now with mobility restriction already in place, and with pandemic on top, COVID kind of brings in a double restriction, and thereby it majorly denies the much needed agency that girl children and children with other gender identifications could empower themselves with. So I mean, so from that perspective, it invokes a lot of concern that whether these children will be able to continue with education in a post-COVID situation, and so that that kind of empowers them to resist the structural normativity. And a third concern, and after which I will stop and we can just open the house for further discussion. A third concern, as when you rightly pointed out, regarding solidarity and support groups of women, but I'm just stretching that argument to include the LGBTQ population. So a lot of LGBTQ people, they survive through solidarity and friendships and maintaining a physical social network, not just a digital in the digital space, but a lot of informal and formal physical meetings with each other to share their stories and experiences. And this is true for all over the world. Now with COVID and mobility restrictions, these solidarity networks are suffering. So in fact, people who need this network so much more, they are now stuck at home, or maybe they are in some shelters, or often they're out on the streets because they cannot afford to find a safe space, a safe home for themselves without their comrades and peers. Moreover, a social stigma that they face is enormous, and that they are facing now because of the pandemic is also so much more, because they are always used to facing a lot of social stigma from heteronormative communities. And now, because they are maybe socially vulnerable and sometimes financially challenged, they cannot really afford to maintain certain health protocols, and because of which they are even more vulnerable and more experiencing the social stigma even at a more fierce level. So this is another consequence of the pandemic that I think we need to engage. And how are the LGBTQ communities going to get through this pandemic is a big question that I have at the moment. So with this, I will stop now, and I would like to open the house and invite our listeners to participate in the conversation, so that we can just continue with what I was just talking about, and or maybe Professor Datta has been talking about so far, and we can just continue the conversation, but with now all of you joining us in. So let us open the house now.